Chapter 21. Example of swap, credit default swap. In the previous video, we have seen what is a currency swap. In this video, we are going to understand what is credit default swap. Before understanding credit default swap, let us consider a scenario. There are two parties, one is lender and another person is borrower. Lender is a person who lends his money and borrower is a person who takes that money and in return he will be giving a specific interest. So in this scenario, borrower receives the money, lender receives the interest payments. But there is a risk for lender. The risk is, what if the borrower defaults the payments? Means what if borrower doesn't pay the initial borrowed money as well as interest to the lender? So lender can enjoy the interest as long as the borrower pays him. So in a normal scenario, the lender is associated with this risk. So lender, if he enters into a credit default swap, he can transfer this risk to some other party and ensure that suppose the borrower fails to pay the interest payments and principal, the other party which is there in the credit default swap is going to compensate for it. It is as simple as taking an insurance policy on the borrower's default. So credit default swap is very different from interest rate swap and currency swap, because in credit default swap it is associated with an event of default which is done by borrower. So credit default swap is nothing but which protects the lender in the event of default on the part of the borrower by transmitting this associated risk in return for a periodic income payments. So here the main thing is the event of default, if the borrower happens, that risk is transferred and it is mitigated by using a credit default swap. Let us see by an example how this happens. So here there are two parties which are in red, which is one is borrowing party, one is a lending party. So borrowing party, here let's consider an example that borrowing party issued a bond. So what is a bond? Bond is issued for a fixed bond is issued by a company to acquire certain capital. In return they are going to pay certain interest. So the lender will buy the bond from borrowing party, which is issuer. So lender will become the bond holder. Now in return, borrowing party will give periodic income payments every time as agreed by the bond. But here the problem is, what if the borrowing party runs into a problem, runs into a credit problem or credit crisis? What if the borrowing party goes to default? It might be bankruptcy, it might be some liquidity crisis or any other credit crisis. So in that scenario, the lender will not receive the periodic income payments and he might even lose his initial notional value also, the initial principal value. So to avoid this scenario, the lender want to ensure that this particular loss that can occur from the borrowing party, it enters into a credit default swap agreement with some other party. In this scenario, it might be an insurer. See here, which is in the blue, the insurer party. So what happens is, the lender here in this credit default swap agreement is nothing but a protection buyer. He is a bond holder in the initial agreement, but here is a protection buyer. He wants to buy this protection that whatever the default that is done by the borrowing party is done, so that can be compensated. So it is simple. In simple terms, it is like the lender is taking an insurance policy from a company. So whatever the default happened by the borrower, this insurer is going to compensate. So this insurer will charge certain interest, which is like X basis point per annum, some interest, and in return what insurer will tell lender is that I am going to compensate you only if the borrowing party defaults. So here, unlike the other swaps where both the parties exchange principal and interest or floating to fixed interest, but here the scenario is different. Here one party will basically give certain interest, from protection buyer will give certain interest to protection seller, the insurer, but on return insurer seller or protection seller will not pay the amount in return all the time. It is dependent, it is like a contingent payment. Contingency means on happening of an event they will pay. So what event? If the borrowing party fails to fulfill the obligations, like not paying interest payments or not paying the principal amount, in that case the insurer will in return pay the compensated loss, pay the loss that the lender had acquired. He will even pay the interest payment whatever is lost, as well as along with the principal payments. So in a credit default swap, what happens is the protection buyer, the lender here, buys a protection from the protection seller, insurer, with some interest. In return, the insurer will get the interest payment for selling this protection, and he will enjoy the profit as long as the borrowing party to the lender will not default. So the insurer profit here is he will keep the interest as long as there is no default between borrowing party and the lender. So but once the default happens, then the whatever the loss that lender has acquired from borrowing party will be compensated from insurance or the protection seller. So in this swap the complete swap happens only when the borrower defaults. Otherwise the lender will pay the interest premiums to the insurer, and insurer will enjoy the profit as long as the borrowing party doesn't default. So this is an example of credit default swap. So let us see an example here. Frank holds a 5-year bonds with some ABC company. So ABC company, what it does is it has issued some bonds for $10,000 and it told a coupon interest of $1,000 per year. So as the ABC company has promised that it is going to pay $1,000 on $10,000 of investment which Frank put in their company. So the Frank is okay with the bond, but the only fear the Frank has is, what if a ABC company goes to some kind of crisis, which is nothing but a credit event. The credit event can be like a bankruptcy situation, insolvency situation, or any liquidity crisis or any other credit crisis where the ABC company is not in a position to pay the value of the bond along with its interest rate. So Frank wants to eliminate this risk. So Frank enters a credit default swap with Sally, telling that, okay, I would pay you $250 per year, and in return Sally will tell, okay, in case ABC company is going to fail, then I am going to compensate the $10,000 of initial amount as well as along with $1,000 of interest. So Sally agrees Frank to pay all the amount and whatever the remaining interest payments which are left over. But this is only paid, or it is contingent to certain thing, that when company ABC defaults or ABC goes to crisis, then only Sally will get this. So Sally, on the other hand, will receive $250, so that Sally is like an protection seller. So she receives $250 as a payment and enjoys this profit of $250 as long as company ABC doesn't default to Frank. So scenario here we can see the company ABC told to Frank that on the bond promised that it will pay $1,000 per annum. So Frank just want to be more careful, so that he want to eliminate the loss or the default loss. if ABC company is going to go in a credit crisis. So he basically buys a protection from Sally, who is a protection seller, who takes $250 from Frank. In return, Sally would be paying $10,000 of principal as $1,000 of interest, whatever the date till the maturity. But this payment is subject to or in condition that ABC defaults the promise that was made to Frank. So in simple terms, the bond between company ABC and Frank fails, then the Sally would compensate the principal and the interest amount on that particular scenario. So this is a credit default swap. So credit default swap is little different because the scenarios of swap happens only when a credit event happens. So in this video we have seen what is a credit default swap. In the next video we are going to see example of commodity swap. You can subscribe the channel by clicking the bell icon. You can send feedback to demystifying.derivatives@gmail.com. Thank you.